It was supposed to be just another quiet evening. The soft hum of chatter from nearby tables, the clinking of silverware, and the subtle scent of gourmet dishes filling the air. Nothing unusual for a high-end restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. Carrie Moss was no stranger to the atmosphere. After all, she'd spent enough time in these kinds of places over the years, though tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't here as Trinity from The Matrix, but as herself, just another person trying to enjoy a peaceful night out with friends. She sat back in her chair, the soft leather cradling her, as she looked around the room. It had been a hectic few weeks, filled with interviews, premieres, and constant paparazzi flashes. All she wanted now was a quiet meal and a few hours without the weight of the public eye. Her friends, Tom, Lisa, and Jake, were all there with her, people who knew her long before the cameras came into play. They were the ones who understood that she wasn't just an actress, but a person with the same desires and frustrations as anyone else. The waiter approached, a tall, slightly aloof man with slicked-back hair and an air of impatience. He didn't seem particularly enthused to be serving this table, and Carrie immediately noticed the way his eyes flicked over her. She couldn't recall the last time she felt truly anonymous in a public space, but tonight, she hoped she could at least blend in for a little while longer. "Good evening," the waiter said, his tone flat, not bothering to mask his indifference. Carrie smiled politely, trying to keep things light. "Good evening," she replied, glancing at the menu. "I'll have the salmon, please." There was a brief pause, and Carrie looked up to find the waiter eyeing her with a strange look. It wasn't the kind of gaze one would expect from a professional waiter. There was something else there, something judgmental. "The salmon," he repeated, still eyeing her as if this was some kind of mockery. "Sure, Ms. Moss. I'm sure you'll enjoy it." His emphasis on the word enjoy was laced with an undercurrent of sarcasm that Carrie couldn't ignore. The table went still. A hush fell over the group as the waiter's comment landed like a stone in the water. The others exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. Carrie felt her cheeks flush slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had experienced rude comments before, but this was different. This wasn't a fan joking, or even a casual passerby making a remark. This felt personal, as if the waiter had crossed a line without even realizing it. She swallowed her initial instinct to snap back and instead looked at him, her voice cool and measured. "Is something wrong with the salmon?" she asked, the smile still on her face but her eyes narrowing slightly. The waiter, who had already turned his attention to the next customer, didn't seem to care. He threw a quick glance over his shoulder before muttering, "Nothing at all. Enjoy your meal." Before Carrie could respond, the waiter had already walked off, his back turned in a way that suggested he hadn't intended to be heard. Her friend sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Jake, always the first to act, opened his mouth to speak, but Lisa quickly put a hand on his arm, shaking her head. There were so many ways this could go wrong. Carrie took a deep breath, letting the moment pass. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But her friends could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she clenched her fists under the table. The restaurant had resumed its usual rhythm, except for the growing discomfort that lingered at their table. Carrie was used to the scrutiny, the stares, the assumptions, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't about being recognized. It was about being treated as less than. "Let it go, Carrie," Tom said gently. "Don't let him ruin your night." She smiled, appreciating the gesture, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling of being belittled. It wasn't just a comment. It was an assault on her dignity, and for a brief moment, she wondered what it would be like to just walk out of the restaurant, to escape the scrutiny that followed her wherever she went. But then the doors swung open, and a familiar face entered. It was Keanu Reeves. The room seemed to hold its breath for a split second as Keanu's presence filled the space. His calm demeanor and unmistakable aura cut through the tension like a knife. The hum of conversation shifted, and people turned their heads to glance at him. He wasn't just an actor. He was Keanu Reeves, the man who had transcended Hollywood stardom to become a symbol of kindness, humility, and strength. Carrie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him in months, and their brief encounters over the years had always been warm but fleeting. He hadn't noticed her yet, his attention focused on the hostess. But for Carrie, his arrival felt like a lifeline, something that would change the trajectory of her evening. The waiter, who had been so quick to belittle her, didn't seem to recognize Keanu at first. He continued to serve the other tables, until Keanu's voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me," Keanu said, approaching the waiter. "Can I have a word with you?" The waiter froze. There was something about Keanu's tone, calm but firm, that made it impossible to ignore. The whole room watched as Keanu stepped forward, his quiet strength palpable in the air. Carrie sat back in her chair, her heart racing. Was this really happening? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Carrie Moss had always been the kind of person who sought balance in a world that demanded extremes. Fame had come to her at a young age, and while it opened doors to unimaginable opportunities, it also created an invisible barrier between her and the real world. The constant spotlight, the cameras, the assumptions, it all became a part of the package, but it wasn't always easy to carry. Before the fame, she was just Carrie, a girl from Vancouver who dreamed of something more. Raised in a modest home with a supportive mother and father, she never imagined that her passion for acting would propel her to the stages of Hollywood. She started her career in small roles, appearing in television shows, and slowly building her name. She had always been driven, but it wasn't until The Matrix that she felt her life would never be the same. When she landed the role of Trinity, the fierce and determined fighter in the groundbreaking film, the world took notice. The film exploded in popularity, and suddenly, Carrie was no longer just a young woman trying to make her mark. She was an icon. The film's success catapulted her into the kind of fame that only a few actors ever truly experience. But with that fame came expectations. People expected her to be perfect. They expected her to be Trinity, to be fearless, to be unbreakable. The reality, however, was far different. Carrie was far from perfect. She had insecurities, doubts, and moments of weakness. There were nights when she'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if people would still care about her once the novelty wore off. She had learned to compartmentalize, to put on the mask of the confident, unshakable actress when she was in the public eye. But at times like this, when she was on her own, away from the red carpets and flashing cameras, she longed for something real. That was why nights like tonight meant so much to her. It wasn't about the food or the luxury of the restaurant. It was about the rare chance to sit down with people who treated her like a human being. Her friends, Tom, Lisa, and Jake, had known her long before The Matrix changed everything. They had seen her at her lowest, when she was just a struggling actress trying to make ends meet, and they had cheered her on as she rose to the top. They didn't see her as an A-list star. They saw her as the girl who loved to laugh, the woman who cared deeply about the people she loved. Tonight, though, the comfort of being surrounded by her friends was suddenly threatened by the waiter's unwarranted rudeness. It was one of those moments that reminded her just how exhausting it could be to constantly be under a microscope. The waiter's disdain wasn't just about her being an actress. It was about his assumption that, because of her fame, she was somehow less deserving of basic respect. It was a reminder that no matter how much she achieved or how much she did, there would always be people who saw her as just an image. Nothing more, nothing less. As the waiter walked away, Carrie found herself lost in thought. She wasn't someone who often let insults get to her. She had learned long ago how to brush off the negativity that came with her job. But this was different. The way the waiter had looked at her, the way he had dismissed her order, it wasn't just rude, it was personal. Her friends could see it in her eyes. They could see the vulnerability that had briefly flickered across her face, like a crack in her armor. Tom, who had been her closest friend since her early days in the industry, leaned in and spoke softly. "Carrie, you know it's not you, right?" he said. "People like him, they just don't know any better." Carrie smiled, grateful for his words, but she knew there was more to it. It wasn't just about this one waiter. It was about the constant judgment that came with her public persona. Sometimes, it felt like no matter how hard she tried, she could never be seen for who she truly was. Lisa, ever the optimist, chimed in, "You're a queen, Carrie. Let him have his moment. He'll regret it." Carrie Ann appreciated the sentiment, but she knew this wasn't something that would simply disappear. The feeling of being insulted, of being made to feel small, lingered. It always did. But then, just as the weight of the moment began to settle in, something shifted. The sound of the door opening brought Carrie Ann's attention back to the present, and she looked up to see Keanu Reeves stepping into the restaurant. Her heart skipped a beat. Keanu was not just an actor. He was someone Carrie Ann admired deeply. He wasn't just known for his incredible roles in films like John Wick and The Matrix. He was known for his genuine kindness and humility, qualities that had earned him a reputation as one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. The media often portrayed him as a humble, down-to-earth person, but Carrie Ann knew that the man behind the public image was even more incredible than people realized. Keanu had always been someone who cared about the people around him. He was the kind of person who didn't just offer help. He showed up when it mattered most. Carrie Ann had experienced his quiet kindness a few times before, and it had always left a lasting impression. But she hadn't expected him to show up tonight, certainly not in the midst of her own struggle. As Keanu made his way through the restaurant, heads turned. It was impossible not to notice him. He had this effortless presence, a calm that settled over the room the moment he walked in. The waiter, still oblivious to the weight of the situation, continued serving other tables, until Keanu approached him. Carrie Ann's heart raced as she watched from her seat, her mind unable to process the surreal nature of what was happening. The man who had just insulted her was now standing face to face with one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood, a man who seemed to have a quiet authority about him. Keanu glanced over at Carrie Ann, then back at the waiter. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it that made everyone in the room stop and pay attention. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I think you owe my friend an apology." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply right. The waiter froze. He turned to look at Keanu, then back to Carrie Ann, realizing, for the first time, the gravity of his mistake. And just like that, the room seemed to exhale. The tension in the room was palpable as the waiter slowly turned toward Keanu, his face flushed with realization. Carrie Ann could see the immediate shift in the man's demeanor. His body language became tense, his eyes darting between the two of them. The power dynamic had just changed in an instant. Keanu, as always, exuded a quiet confidence, his posture relaxed but his eyes firm. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but he wasn't backing down either. He wasn't the kind of person who thrived on drama, but his actions had already set something in motion. Carrie Ann wasn't sure what would happen next, but she could feel her pulse quicken. The moment the waiter had insulted her, she had debated whether to let it go or speak up. But now, with Keanu standing up for her, she realized just how much it mattered. How much the simple act of standing up for someone could make a difference. And it wasn't just about her. It was about the principle of treating people with respect. The waiter's face was red now, embarrassment painting his features. He stammered for a moment, unsure of how to respond to Keanu's directness. I didn't mean," he started, but Keanu didn't let him finish. "It's not about what you meant," Keanu said, his voice steady, his gaze never leaving the waiter. "It's about what you said, and the way you said it. People deserve more than that." The quiet room was filled with an unexpected intensity. People at nearby tables had stopped talking, watching this strange interaction unfold. Carrie Ann could feel their eyes on her, but for the first time in the evening, it wasn't the kind of gaze that made her feel uncomfortable. It wasn't judgmental or prying. It was a collective holding of breath, people witnessing something they rarely saw. The waiter opened his mouth again, but this time, he didn't speak right away. His shoulders slumped as he realized the weight of his actions. He glanced at Carrie Ann, his face no longer defensive, but full of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to disrespect you." Keanu nodded, his expression softening slightly. It's important to show respect to everyone, no matter who they are. Carrie Ann could feel the knot in her stomach loosen. She wasn't entirely sure what had just happened, but she knew she wouldn't be looking at this night the same way anymore. It wasn't just about the waiter's apology. It was about the sense of agency that Keanu had just handed her. The way he had intervened, without hesitation, without making a scene. It felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that kindness still had power. But as the apology lingered in the air, something else simmered beneath the surface. The waiter, though chastened, still hadn't fully come to terms with the situation. He quickly turned away, mumbling an awkward apology before rushing off to the kitchen, eager to escape the awkwardness. Carrie-Ann's friends sat in stunned silence, processing what had just unfolded. Tom, who had been ready to jump to her defense himself, looked over at her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, breaking the silence. Carrie-Ann chuckled, though it was laced with a hint of nervous energy. "Yeah, unexpected is one way to put it." Jake leaned forward, a wry smile on his face. Keanu Reeves, the unofficial hero of the night. Seriously, I thought I was going to have to step in, but he handled it like a pro. Lisa, who had been quiet for a moment, smiled as well. He's always been like that. You know, kind and grounded. No drama. Just right when it counts. Carrie-Ann nodded, her gaze still on the door where the waiter had disappeared. The situation had been handled, yes, but she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions welling up inside her. Gratitude, yes, Keanu had been her silent ally in that moment. But there was also a lingering sense of discomfort. The whole incident had revealed something that she hadn't been willing to confront. The way people treated her based on assumptions, based on her fame, was something that still stung deeply. She had tried so hard to not let it affect her, but there were moments like this when it became impossible to ignore. "I appreciate what Keanu did," Carrie-Ann said, her voice thoughtful. "But it's not just about that moment. It's about the bigger picture, you know? People don't always see you for who you are. They see the image, the person they've created in their heads. And it's exhausting." Tom nodded. "I get it. But that's why we're here. To remind you of who you really are. Not the image, not the actress, but the real Carrie." Her eyes softened as she looked at her friends. They were always there for her, even when the world wasn't. But tonight, something had shifted. The waiter's disrespect had triggered something deeper within her, and she knew it wasn't just about the insult. It was about how often she had to hide behind her public persona and how rarely she was able to be the real Carrie. Just a woman trying to live her life. Before she could respond, Keanu returned to the table, his calm presence filling the space once again. His demeanor was still humble, but there was a spark in his eyes that showed he wasn't just some passerby. He had witnessed something, and now, he was here for it. He smiled at Carrie-Ann as he approached. "I hope I didn't cause too much trouble," he said softly. "I just couldn't let that slide." Carrie-Ann smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Keanu, thank you. Really?" Keanu shrugged, as if what he did was just a natural thing to do. "No need to thank me. It's just what's right." But as he spoke those words, Carrie-Ann couldn't shake the feeling that something more had happened in that exchange. The waiter's apology had been the surface-level resolution, but beneath it, Keanu's simple act of kindness had opened up a conversation Carrie-Ann wasn't ready to have. A conversation about how she saw herself, how others saw her, and how much of her own identity she was willing to sacrifice for the sake of her career. As the night went on, the tension began to lift, but the question that lingered in Carrie-Ann's mind wasn't so easily shaken. What had this night really been about? Was it just a dinner, or was it a turning point? As the evening wore on, Carrie-Ann found herself lost in thought. The dinner had taken a strange turn. What was supposed to be a relaxing night out with friends had become a deep reflection on who she was and how others saw her. The interaction with the waiter, the unexpected intervention by Keanu, those moments had stirred something in her that she couldn't shake. The soft hum of conversation around her, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional laughter of her friends seemed distant. Carrie-Ann felt like she was in a world of her own, trapped in her thoughts, as the evening's events replayed over and over in her mind. Keanu had returned to his table, but every so often, his gaze would flicker toward her. He had been a quiet presence in her life since the early days of The Matrix, but tonight, something had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared bond of not just being actors in the same world, but of understanding the weight of the roles they played, both on screen and off. After a while, Tom leaned in, noticing the distant look on Carrie Ann's face. "Hey, you good?" he asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Carrie Ann smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, just thinking. You know how it is." Tom didn't push her further, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. He had seen this side of her before, the side that came out when she felt overwhelmed by the demands of fame and the expectations of others. "I get it, but whatever it is, you don't have to do it alone." Her heart warmed at his words. He had always been her anchor, the one person who saw her for who she truly was, not the person the world thought she should be. But tonight, the weight of the world felt heavier than usual. As if sensing her inner turmoil, Keanu stood up from his table and walked over to her. His footsteps were quiet, almost reverent, and his presence had a calming effect that Carrie Ann didn't realize she needed until now. There was a warmth in his eyes, a gentle understanding that she couldn't quite explain. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to disrupt the quiet atmosphere she seemed to be enveloped in. Carrie Ann nodded, gesturing to the empty seat next to her. "Of course. I'm just trying to process everything, I guess." Keanu sat down, his calm energy filling the space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Keanu understood the need for silence sometimes, especially when words weren't enough. Finally, Carrie Ann spoke, her voice soft. "You know, it's funny. I've been doing this for so long, and I still don't know how to handle moments like this. The way people treat you, the way they assume things about you just because of who you are or what you've done. It's like I'm not allowed to just be." Keanu nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get it. It's a strange world we live in, isn't it? People see us on screen, and they think they know us. But they don't. It's easy to forget that we're just people underneath it all." Carrie Ann looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of judgment, but there was none. Just understanding. It was rare to find that in a world full of people who only saw the surface. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not just about the fans, though. It's everything. The pressure to be something I'm not. The expectations. I've spent so much of my life trying to live up to an image, to be who everyone thinks I should be. And now, I don't even know who I am anymore." Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression serious but gentle. "I think that's something a lot of people struggle with, even if they don't admit it. The world has a way of shaping us into something we don't always recognize. But that doesn't mean you have to keep living up to those expectations. You can create your own path, Carrie. You don't have to be anyone's idea of who you should be." Carrie Ann looked at him, her heart aching. "It's hard, though, especially when the world is constantly telling you who you are. It's like you're trapped in this cycle of validation, always needing to prove yourself, always needing to be perfect." Keanu's gaze softened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but steady. "Perfection is a myth. It's an idea that doesn't exist. You're already enough as you are. All of us are." For a long moment, Carrie Ann didn't say anything. She simply absorbed his words, feeling the weight of them sink in. It was true. She had spent so much of her life chasing perfection, trying to be something she thought the world wanted her to be. But what if that wasn't the answer? What if she could let go of the need to be perfect and just live? Keanu's presence was like a balm to her wounded soul. He wasn't offering solutions or giving her advice she hadn't heard before. Instead, he was offering something more valuable, his quiet, unwavering belief in her, that she was enough, just as she was. The sound of her friends laughing in the background pulled Carrie Ann back to the present. She glanced over at them, her heart lightening just a little. For the first time tonight, she felt like she was starting to breathe again. Maybe it wasn't all about the grand gestures or the applause. Maybe it was about the quiet moments of clarity, the times when she could step back and remember who she really was. Keanu stood up, giving her a small smile. "You're not alone in this, Carrie. We all have our moments, but we also have the strength to overcome them. You just have to believe that." Carrie Ann returned his smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Keanu. Really, I needed to hear that." He nodded, giving her a brief, warm pat on the shoulder before turning to leave. But before he walked away, he paused and glanced back at her. "You've got this." As Keanu walked back to his table, Carrie felt a sense of peace wash over her. The weight on her chest had lifted, if only for a moment, but it was enough to remind her that she didn't have to carry everything alone. And in that moment, Carrie realized something important. She didn't have to chase perfection. She didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations but her own. What mattered most was staying true to herself, finding her own path, and trusting that she was enough, exactly as she was. The night's quiet reflection was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected phone call. Carrie had almost forgotten about the weight of the world outside the warm cocoon of the restaurant. But as the screen of her phone lit up, her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name flashing across the screen. It was her agent. Her stomach tightened, and she hesitated for a split second before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice a little shakier than she intended. "Carrie, we need to talk," came the voice on the other end. It was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her blood run cold. "There's been a development with the movie contract. They're pushing for a change in your role, more screen time, but also more pressure. You have to be ready for the next step. They want you to go public with the new deal. It's time to step up, be the star again." Her agent's words were all business, and yet Carrie couldn't shake the feeling that something else was looming beneath the surface. She had heard this talk before. The promises of fame, the demands of constant exposure, the expectations that came with being in the spotlight. But tonight, something inside her was different. She had just opened herself up to a new way of thinking, a way of being. And yet, here it was again. The same old push to be something more, to be something she wasn't sure she could be anymore. The pressure was building again, and for the first time in a long time, Carrie wasn't sure if she wanted to play the game anymore. "Carrie, are you there?" Her agent's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "I need you to respond. This is a big opportunity." Carrie squeezed her eyes shut, feeling a rush of emotions collide inside her. She wanted to hang up. She wanted to tell her agent that she needed a break, that she was tired of being pushed around. But she knew the stakes and the fear of losing everything. The fame, the success, the work, was still present. I'm here," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm tired. I don't know who I am when I'm not the person people want me to be." The silence on the other end was thick, as though her agent was trying to process what she had just said. Carrie could almost hear the frustration building. "Carrie, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You can't just throw it away." The words stung. They always did. But something inside her snapped. She didn't want to be someone's opportunity anymore. She didn't want to be the face on a billboard, the name on a movie poster. She didn't want to be a product. "I'm not an opportunity," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength of her voice. "I'm a person, and I'm done pretending that I'm okay with all of this. I need to figure out who I really am, outside of all the expectations, outside of all the noise." There was a long pause before her agent spoke again, and when they did, their tone had softened. "I hear you, Carrie, but I want you to really think about this. You've worked so hard to get to where you are. Don't throw it away without giving it serious thought." Carrie didn't know how to respond. What could she say? The truth was, the pressure, the expectations, they had been suffocating her for years. She had spent so much of her life chasing approval, seeking validation from people she barely knew. But who was she really, when all the cameras were off and the red carpets had been rolled up? She felt a weight lift as she heard herself speak again, but this time, her voice was clear, free from the doubt that usually clouded her thoughts. "I don't want to keep living for other people," she said softly. "I've been so afraid of what might happen if I step away, but I think it's time for me to live for myself." Her agent didn't reply right away, but Carrie could hear the shift in the air, the understanding that she had reached some kind of turning point. And in that moment, Carrie realized how much power she had, power she hadn't fully embraced before. As she hung up the phone, her hand trembling slightly, the room seemed to fall into a kind of stillness. The noise from the restaurant faded as she sat back in her chair, her chest heaving with the enormity of what she had just said. The fear, the uncertainty, the guilt. It all swirled inside her. But she also felt something else, a sense of freedom, the first real breath she had taken in a long time. Keanu, who had been watching from across the table, stood and walked over to her without hesitation. He could sense the shift in her energy, the weight that had just been lifted from her shoulders. He didn't ask what had happened, but his gaze was kind and knowing. He simply sat down next to her, offering his quiet support. "You're not alone in this," Keanu said softly, his voice steady, grounded. Carrie looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the world on her shoulders. There was a sense of relief in her chest, a feeling of release that she had been craving for so long. She didn't have to carry the weight of others' expectations anymore. She didn't have to be anyone's idea of who she should be. She finally spoke, her voice filled with emotion. I think I'm ready to start living for myself, to figure out who I really am, without the noise." Keanu's eyes softened, and he gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You've always had that strength, Carrie. It was just buried under all the other stuff. But you're here now, and that's enough." As the evening continued, the conversation around her became distant once more. But this time, the stillness didn't feel heavy. It felt like a fresh start. For the first time in years, Carrie felt at peace, knowing that the only person she needed to please was herself. And as the world outside kept turning, Carrie realized that she didn't need to be everything to everyone. She didn't need to chase an image that wasn't her own. All she needed to do was embrace who she truly was, and for the first time in a long while, she was ready to do exactly that. The days that followed Carrie's phone call were a blur of emotions. She had made the decision to step away from the constant rush of Hollywood's demands, but the transition wasn't going to be easy. The industry didn't stop just because one person decided to take a break. The calls still came, the emails still flooded her inbox, and the constant hum of expectations never fully ceased. But for the first time in her life, Carrie wasn't listening to the noise. Instead, she was listening to herself. She spent the following weeks traveling, going places she'd never had the time to visit before. For once, there was no tight schedule or looming deadline hanging over her. It was just her, the open road, and the space to rediscover who she was beyond the cameras and the red carpets. Carrie began to feel the weight of the years of living for others slowly lift. She rediscovered passions she'd long forgotten, from painting to hiking in the mountains. She spent quiet mornings reading books, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. And as she reflected on the journey she had been on, she realized that this was the beginning of something entirely new. During her travels, Carrie had kept in touch with Keanu. His words had lingered in her mind ever since that night, and every conversation they shared was a reminder that there was more to life than chasing the next big thing. His support had been unwavering, and she found herself truly grateful for his presence in her life, not just as a friend, but as someone who had helped her find clarity when she had almost lost her way. One afternoon, as Carrie sat in a quiet cafe by the coast, she received a message from Keanu. "Hey, I'm in town for a few days. Want to meet up? I think you'll find something interesting to do here. I've found a little spot where the world feels far away from all the chaos." Carrie smiled to herself, reading the message. She hadn't realized how much she missed the simplicity of their friendship, how much she missed having someone who understood her on a deeper level. She replied almost immediately, "I'd love that. Let me know when you're free, and I'll meet you there." Keanu's response was quick. "Perfect. I'll send you the details. I'll be waiting." The meeting place was a small bookstore tucked away in a quiet corner of town, away from the typical tourist spots. When Carrie arrived, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The place was cozy, with warm wooden shelves stacked high with books of all kinds, from classic novels to obscure poetry collections. The air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. It was a place that seemed untouched by the world outside, and that's exactly what Carrie needed. As she walked in, her eyes immediately found Keanu, sitting at a small table in the back, a coffee cup in front of him, and a book open in his hands. He looked up as she approached, his familiar smile instantly putting her at ease. "Hey," he greeted her, standing to hug her lightly. "Good to see you." "You too," she said, her voice warm. "This place is incredible. I love it here." Keanu smiled and gestured to the table. "I thought you might. It's a nice escape from everything. And it's one of the few places I can actually think without someone asking for an autograph or taking a picture." Carrie sat down across from him, a relaxed sigh escaping her lips. "I'm starting to get used to the quiet. It's a nice change, honestly." They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. The books they had been reading, the people they had met, and the places they traveled. But it wasn't the usual small talk. It was real, raw conversation, the kind of talk that comes from a place of mutual respect and understanding, the kind that Carrie had been craving for so long. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Carrie said, taking a sip of her coffee, "about everything. The career, the fame, the pressure. I realized that for so long, I was living a life that wasn't really mine. I let other people's expectations shape who I was. But now, I think I'm finally ready to live for myself." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a big realization, and it's not easy, but I think it's the right one. We all have to find our own way, at our own pace. And sometimes that means stepping away from everything we thought we wanted." Carrie smiled, her heart feeling lighter with each word he spoke. "You were right, Keanu. About everything. I've spent so many years trying to please everyone else, trying to be what they wanted me to be. But I can't do that anymore. I need to be true to myself." Keanu leaned forward, his gaze sincere. "That's what makes you who you are. Not the roles, not the fame, not the image. It's who you are beneath all of that. And I'm proud of you for realizing that." Carrie's eyes welled up with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief, of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without your support. You've helped me see things so clearly." Keanu reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've always had it in you, Carrie. I just reminded you of it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed so far away in that small bookstore, as if the noise of the world had been silenced. And in that silence, Carrie finally felt the peace she had been searching for. The realization was simple, yet profound. She didn't need to keep chasing something that wasn't hers. She had always had everything she needed inside her all along. As the afternoon sun began to set, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, Carrie knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The beginning of a life lived on her own terms, a life where she didn't need to prove anything to anyone except herself. And for the first time in years, she was truly free. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Carrie had embraced her new way of life with a sense of calm and purpose she had never known before. Her time spent away from the limelight had been transformative. It was as though she was shedding layers of an old skin she had worn for far too long. Her phone, once a constant source of buzzing demands and inquiries, now sat quietly on the table beside her. She had intentionally distanced herself from the Hollywood whirlwind, opting for real, face-to-face connections and moments of solitude that felt restorative. Carrie's newfound peace was grounded in the realization that there was life beyond the rush of fame, a life full of potential, creativity, and love. She returned to the basics, working on small independent projects that reignited her passion for acting without the overwhelming pressure. She discovered new hobbies like writing poetry and taking long walks by the beach, where the vastness of the ocean allowed her to think deeply about the future. Though her agent had called a few times, asking if she was ready to return to the spotlight, Carrie remained resolute in her decision. She was no longer interested in chasing fleeting fame. Instead, she was focused on building a life that aligned with her authentic self. One afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation, one that, for a moment, made her reconsider her path. The invitation came from an old colleague and friend in the industry, an up-and-coming director who had been working on a film that was receiving buzz. The project had been described as a groundbreaking, thought-provoking film about self-discovery, and the director wanted Carrie to be part of it. The offer was tempting. It wasn't the typical high-budget blockbuster role she was used to, but something about it felt real, something that could resonate with the new version of herself she had become. Carrie was intrigued, but also cautious. Keanu, who had continued to be her steadfast friend throughout this process, had sensed her hesitation when she called him to discuss the offer. "What's holding you back?" he asked gently, as they sat in a cafe, sipping their drinks. Carrie leaned back in her chair, her mind whirring. It's a huge step. I've been so focused on staying out of the spotlight. I'm not sure if I'm ready to dive back in. But at the same time, this project feels different. It feels like it could be meaningful." Keanu smiled, his eyes calm but understanding. "You've changed. You've grown. And sometimes, the things that challenge us the most are the things that allow us to grow even more. If this role speaks to you, I think you should go for it. But this time, make it yours. Do it for the right reasons." Carrie nodded, the weight of his words settling into her soul. She realized that, whatever she decided, it was about being true to herself. If she chose to return to acting, it couldn't be for fame or validation. It had to be because the role aligned with her values and her vision for the future. After some thought, Carrie called her agent and accepted the role. It wasn't about trying to reclaim an old version of herself. It was about moving forward and finding a way to share her journey in a way that could inspire others. She was ready to step back into the world of acting, but this time, she would do it on her own terms. The first day of filming arrived, and Carrie felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness. The studio was buzzing with activity, but there was something different in the air. The pressure to impress wasn't there. There was no fear of judgment or expectation to be something she wasn't. Instead, there was a sense of purpose, a shared vision between the cast and crew that this was more than just a movie. It was an exploration of the human experience, of what it meant to truly live authentically. Keanu had been the first to reach out with words of encouragement after she'd signed on. He texted her that morning, a simple message that made her smile. "Enjoy the ride, Carrie. You're doing it for the right reasons." As she arrived on set, she saw the director, a passionate woman named Lila, who greeted her with warmth and enthusiasm. "Carrie, I'm so glad you're here. We're going to create something special together. This film is all about truth, your truth, the truth of the characters. I can't wait to see what you bring to the table." Carrie felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was different. The director wasn't interested in creating a star. She was interested in telling a story, one that connected with the audience on a deeper level. The first scene was a difficult one. Carrie had to tap into emotions she hadn't explored in years. The character she was playing was a woman who, like her, had spent her life wearing masks to please others. Now, she was being asked to take them off and embrace her true self, a task that was both terrifying and liberating. As the cameras rolled, Carrie found herself lost in the character, the vulnerability of the scene hitting her in a way that felt raw and real. She wasn't acting. She was living. For the first time in years, she was truly free in her work. The scene wrapped, and as the director called for a break, Carrie felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the acting. It was about her journey. The journey she had taken from being a star trapped in the expectations of others to becoming a woman who could stand tall and unapologetic in her truth. As the days of filming passed, Carrie's confidence grew. She realized that she didn't have to leave everything behind to be happy. She could embrace the things she loved about her career, but this time, she would do it with intention. She would work with people who shared her vision, and she would be true to herself in every role she played. The film, when it was eventually released, was a hit, not because it was the biggest budget production, but because it was real. The audience connected with the characters' struggles, their triumphs, and their journey towards self-acceptance. Critics praised Carrie for her honest, vulnerable performance, and she found herself once again in the spotlight. But this time, it felt different. This time, it was about telling a story, not about seeking approval. One evening, as Carrie watched the sunset from her quiet beach house, she reflected on everything that had brought her to this point. She thought of the difficult moments, the times when she felt lost and uncertain. But she also thought of the friends who had supported her, especially Keanu, whose presence in her life had been a guiding light. Carrie had learned that happiness wasn't something you could chase. It was something you built, step by step, through authenticity, love, and self-acceptance. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first stepped into the world of acting, but she had found something far more important, a sense of peace, of purpose, and of a life well lived. And as she watched the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, she knew that the journey was far from over. It was just beginning. The days had grown longer as the seasons changed, each one bringing Carrie more clarity. She had stepped back into the spotlight, but in a way that felt entirely different from her past. The film she had starred in had received critical acclaim, and though the industry was buzzing about her return, Carrie remained grounded, focused on what mattered most: her own happiness and sense of fulfillment. Keanu had remained by her side throughout this process, and though their friendship had always been a pillar of support, it was clear that their connection had deepened over time. Both had changed, grown, and evolved. They had experienced so much together, yet the bond between them was more meaningful than it had ever been. One evening, Carrie stood in front of her mirror, applying a light coat of makeup. The film she had been working on was now making its way to award season, and she had been invited to attend the ceremonies. The excitement was real, but Carrie couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't afraid of the attention. It was the same feeling she'd had before every big event in her life. But now, it was different. She was no longer chasing approval or validation. She was simply living her truth. Her phone buzzed on the counter beside her, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Keanu. "Hey, I'm in town for the awards show tomorrow. Thought I'd catch up with you for dinner afterward if you're free. Maybe even crash a little party. You in?" Carrie smiled as she read his text. Of course, she was in. It had been a while since they had truly hung out outside of work. The thought of spending a night with him, no glitz, no glam, just two friends catching up, sounded perfect. She quickly replied, "Definitely. Let's make it happen. Looking forward to it." The awards ceremony was held in a grand theater, the red carpet lined with flashing cameras, reporters shouting questions, and fans calling out for autographs. Carrie walked into the venue, her hand lightly resting on the arm of a stylist she barely knew, but her mind was somewhere else. The glamour of the event felt distant to her now. As much as she appreciated the recognition, she knew this wasn't the reason she was there. She was no longer just Carrie Moss, the actress. She was Carrie, the woman who had fought for her own peace, for her own identity. She paused for a moment near the entrance to the theater, taking a deep breath before stepping into the spotlight. She smiled politely for the photographers, but the thrill of it all no longer held the same sway over her. Her focus was on the work, the craft, and the genuine moments that came from connecting with others who shared her passion. Inside the theater, the ceremony unfolded in typical fashion. Acceptance speeches, applause, and countless moments of prestige. Carrie didn't win any awards that night, but it didn't matter. She wasn't there for a trophy. She was there to celebrate the journey she had taken, to honor the growth she had experienced, and to embrace what lay ahead. When the show finally wrapped up, Carrie left the theater feeling lighter, almost as though she had shed yet another layer of expectation. Her phone buzzed again. It was Keanu. "You still up for that dinner?" She stepped outside into the cool night air, the stars above her twinkling. It had been a long evening, but she felt an overwhelming sense of peace as she walked toward the car. She didn't need to be the center of attention anymore. She didn't need anything other than the people she loved and the life she was building for herself. The restaurant Keanu had chosen was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't need a fancy sign to be known. It was warm, welcoming, and filled with the comforting sounds of laughter and conversation. Keanu was already seated at a corner table, his back to the window, a smile on his face as he spotted her. "Carrie," he said, standing up as she approached, "you look fantastic." "Thanks," she said with a grin. "I don't know if I should thank the awards show for that, or the fact that I can now sleep in a little more these days." Keanu chuckled, and they both sat down, the conversation flowing easily between them. They didn't need to talk about the ceremony or her career. They didn't need to discuss the red carpet or the flashing cameras. They were just two friends, catching up, living in the moment. For the first time in a long time, Carrie felt completely at ease. She wasn't playing a role, and neither was Keanu. They were simply two people who had been through their own journeys and had found their way to this place of peace together. After dinner, they wandered through the city, laughing and reminiscing about the old days. There was no rush, no agenda, just a quiet understanding between them. The chaos of the world outside seemed so distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they had each other, and they had built something real, something that was no longer about fame or success, but about authenticity, kindness, and a sense of belonging. As they stood on a street corner, watching the city bustle around them, Keanu turned to her with a smile. "You know, I think we've both come a long way," he said. "It's amazing what happens when we stop chasing things and start living for ourselves." Carrie nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate deeply within her. "Yeah, I think we're finally where we're meant to be." They stood there for a moment, watching the world go by, both of them knowing that the future, whatever it held, was waiting for them. They had been through so much together, and yet, this was only the beginning of their journey. And for Carrie, the future was looking brighter than ever.